In the gray dawn of June the 6th, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were quiet, too quiet. From the German positions along the Atlantic Wall, men stood in the biting wind and peered into the mist, their breath merging with the morning fog that rolled off the channel. The sea looked empty. For months, the officers of the 716th Infantry Division had been told the invasion would come, but it never did. Now, as dawn began to pale the horizon, some still believed the Allies would strike farther north at the Pas de Calais. That was what Berlin insisted. That was what the Führer himself believed. And so the calm before dawn felt, to many, like another false alarm. At 5:30 a.m., the horizon began to flicker with light, distant flashes that shimmered over the water. Moments later, the sound reached them. Not a single blast, but a deep, rolling thunder that grew and grew until it felt as though the earth itself was groaning. Naval guns, over 100 of them, were opening fire from the largest armada in human history. Within minutes, the entire coastline from Ouistreham to Vierville was engulfed in flame and smoke. Telephone lines went dead. Outposts vanished. The air trembled with the shock waves. To the men huddled in the concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, it was not the beginning of a battle. It was the end of the world. Most of the German defenders on the beaches were not elite soldiers. The 342nd Infantry Division, newly arrived from St. Lo, had a hardened corps of veterans from the Eastern Front, but much of the 716th were older men, foreign conscripts, and wounded veterans reassigned to static defense. They had spent months building fortifications, concrete casemates, Tobruk pits, and miles of barbed wire and mines. Rommel's orders had been clear. The enemy must be stopped on the beaches, crushed before they could establish a foothold. But Rommel wasn't there. He was in Germany, visiting his wife for her birthday. And in his absence, command was paralyzed. When reports began flooding in that hundreds of ships were offshore, many German officers hesitated. Some believed it was a diversion. Others waited for confirmation from higher command. By the time the truth became undeniable, it was already too late. At 6:30 a.m., the first landing craft hit the beaches. From the observation posts above Omaha and Juneau, German machine gunners stared in disbelief. Through the smoke and mist, the sea seemed alive, hundreds of gray shapes advancing in tight formation, wave after wave. Then the ramps dropped. Figures poured out, stumbling through waist-deep water, some falling instantly under fire. The gunners opened up. MG-42s roared from every angle, their metallic screams slicing through the air at 1,200 rounds per minute. The beach erupted in chaos, splashes, screams, and the heavy concussion of mortar fire. For a moment, it looked as though the Atlantic Wall was holding. Inside one of the strongpoints overlooking Omaha Beach, Feldwebel Heinrich Severloh, later known as the Beast of Omaha, manned his MG-42 almost without pause. He would claim to have fired over 12,000 rounds that morning. "They just kept coming," he would later say, "like targets on a range, only they screamed." His position, Widerstands Nest 62, was one of the few that remained intact after the naval bombardment. The concrete walls shook with every impact, dust falling from the ceiling as Severloh and his loader fed belt after belt into the gun. The Americans below were pinned down, using the bodies of their comrades as cover. But still, they moved. Inch by inch, they clawed their way forward through the shingle. Elsewhere along the coast, the story was different. At Utah Beach, the American 4th Infantry Division landed nearly 2 kilometers off course. But luck was on their side. The defenses there were lighter, manned by scattered companies of the 709th Division. Within hours, the Americans had broken through and begun moving inland. To the east, British and Canadian forces at Sword, Juno, and Gold faced fierce resistance, but gradually gained ground. In some sectors, German units fought to the last man. At Courseulles-sur-Mer, the 736th Regiment held out for hours under relentless fire until their positions were completely overrun. Yet in others, confusion reigned. Communications were severed. Orders contradicted each other. Many officers could not reach their troops, and local commanders were forced to act on instinct, or not at all. The problem was not the courage of the men, it was the paralysis of the command. At 3 a.m., reports of the landings had reached Army Group B headquarters, but General von Rundstedt hesitated to release the Panzer reserves without direct authorization from Hitler. And Hitler, famously, was asleep. His aides refused to wake him. For nearly 8 critical hours, the divisions that might have counterattacked, the 12th SS Panzer, the Panzer Lehr, and the 21st Panzer Division, sat idle. When they finally received the order to move, the Allies already had tens of thousands of men ashore. The moment to throw them back into the sea had passed. For the German soldiers on the front line, those hours felt like a lifetime. Many fought from isolated bunkers, cut off from communication, surrounded by smoke and confusion. Through narrow vision slits, they saw fragments of the battle. A Sherman tank rolling up the sand, an engineer with a flamethrower clearing a pillbox, a landing craft exploding offshore. The sound of aircraft never stopped. Allied fighter bombers swept the skies, strafing roads and columns, cutting down any attempt at reinforcement. Even when the 21st Panzer finally moved toward Caen, its columns were harassed from above by typhoons and thunderbolts. Pilots described it as a slaughter. By noon, the beaches of Normandy were no longer a battlefield. They were a graveyard. The tide was turning red with blood, littered with bodies, weapons, and shattered landing craft. The smell of cordite and salt hung heavy in the air. Some German soldiers crawled out of their bunkers only to find themselves surrounded. Others fought on until they ran out of ammunition. At Pointe du Hoc, elements of the 352nd Division tried to repel the U.S. Rangers scaling the cliffs. They threw grenades, rolled boulders, fired into the smoke. But by afternoon, the Rangers were at the top, the guns were silenced, and the position lost. For the defenders, it felt like drowning, not in water, but in the relentless tide of men and machines that just kept coming. Behind the front, the chaos was worse. Civilians fled burning villages. Columns of smoke rose over Caen. Every road was jammed with vehicles and wounded men. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. Fuel shortages and Allied air superiority kept most aircraft grounded. German soldiers spoke bitterly of being abandoned by their air force, by their commanders, by Berlin itself. Some officers still believed this was a diversion, that the real invasion was yet to come. But for those staring into the faces of advancing Allied troops, there was no doubt anymore. This was the invasion, and they were losing. In the days that followed, the German defense hardened. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed mostly of teenage soldiers, counterattacked with ferocity near Caen. Their fanaticism shocked even veteran officers. They fought with a desperation born not of discipline, but of indoctrination, a belief that defeat meant the end of everything they had been taught to live for. Yet their courage could not compensate for Allied firepower. Every advance was met with artillery and airstrikes. The fields of Normandy became killing grounds, hedgerows hiding snipers, ditches filled with shattered armor. The German soldiers began to realize they were fighting an enemy who could replace every man, every tank, every bullet. They themselves could not. By mid-June, the German front was cracking. Supply lines were collapsing under bombardment. The Allies had established a continuous beachhead and were pushing inland. Rommel returned to find chaos. Bridges destroyed, roads cratered, communications in ruins. He demanded permission to withdraw to a new defensive line, but Hitler refused. The Führer's orders were absolute. No retreat, no surrender. So the soldiers stayed and died where they stood. Those who survived described the days after D-Day as a blur of exhaustion and disbelief. "We were ghosts," one officer later said, "moving through smoke and ruins with no sense of time, only of loss." Every night, they watched the horizon glow with the fires of Allied bombardments. Every morning, new bodies appeared in the fields. For many, the realization came slowly, that the war was no longer about victory, but survival. That the Reich they had been told was invincible was bleeding to death before their eyes. Historians would later debate whether the German defense on D-Day was doomed from the start. Some argued that no force could have stopped the sheer scale of the Allied invasion. Others claimed that, had the panzer divisions moved at dawn, the beaches might have become a slaughterhouse. But for the men who were there, for the gunners in the bunkers, the infantry in the trenches, the officers staring through binoculars at a horizon on fire, none of that mattered. What they witnessed was the unraveling of an empire. By the end of June, over 400,000 Allied troops were ashore. The Atlantic Wall, once hailed as impregnable, had been shattered in a single day. The German army in the west was fighting in fragments. Its divisions bled dry, its commanders divided between obedience and despair. Rommel himself would not see the war's end, wounded in an air attack in July, and later forced to take his own life under suspicion of treason. Rundstedt would be dismissed for suggesting peace talks, and the men who had once manned the bunkers of Normandy were either buried in its soil or marched into captivity. For them, D-Day was not just a battle. It was a reckoning, a day when every illusion of control, every myth of superiority, was burned away by the cold, relentless fire of reality. They had built a wall of concrete and steel across Europe, believing it could hold back the tide. But in the end, it was not walls that failed. It was the idea itself. And as the sun set over the beaches on June 6, 1944, the survivors of the Atlantic Wall watched the horizon once more. The sea that had been their shield was now the Allies' gateway. The same wind that once carried their banners east now carried the sound of foreign voices, foreign engines, and a future they would never see. For those who lived through that day, it was the moment the war turned, not just for Germany, but for the world. The invasion they had been told would never come had arrived, and with it, the beginning of the end. Night fell over Normandy like a shroud. Fires still burned along the coast, flickering orange veins stretching from Arromanches to Vierville, pulsing in the smoke like the heartbeat of a dying beast. The smell was everywhere: burning oil, seaweed, wet sand, and the sickly sweet stench of cordite and death. For the Germans who remained alive, the silence that followed the thunder of invasion was worse than the noise itself. It was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of Allied aircraft circling overhead and the faint crash of the waves against the wreckage of the Atlantic Wall. In the ruins of a command post near Colleville-sur-Mer, Oberleutnant Fritz Ziegelmann of the 352nd Division wrote in his notebook by candlelight. "No contact with regiment," he scrawled. "No ammunition left. Men exhausted. No reinforcements." Around him, the bunker smelled of damp earth and sweat. His radio man sat slumped against the wall, asleep or dead. It was hard to tell. Outside, the moon revealed a beach that no longer belonged to them. Silhouettes moved among the wreckage, not ghosts, but men. Americans, collecting the wounded, setting up field hospitals, laying down wire. The beachhead was secure. The Reich's western front was gone. Further inland, the night sky glowed with the faint blue of parachute flares. The 6th Airborne Division to the east and the 101st and 82nd to the west had turned the countryside into a maze of ambushes and firefights. German patrols were lost, cut off, or simply vanished. The roads that Rommel had warned must be kept clear were now choked with wrecks and burning vehicles. Columns of the 21st Panzer, attempting to regroup for a counterattack, found themselves hunted by fighter-bombers. Every move, every flicker of headlights, drew a storm of rockets from above. The soldiers called them jabots, the Allied fighter-bombers that prowled the sky like vultures. By dawn, they had learned to fear even the sound of an approaching engine. Rommel returned to the front 2 days after the landings. What he saw defied belief. The beaches were unrecognizable. Vast plains of debris stretching for miles, filled with tanks, trucks, and mountains of supplies unloaded from the endless procession of ships offshore. He had predicted this exact scenario months earlier, arguing that if the Allies established a foothold, Germany would lose the war. Now that prediction was carved into the coastline. When he drove through the countryside, he found villages flattened by naval bombardment, fields cratered like the surface of the moon, and survivors too dazed to speak. One officer described him standing silently by a burning half-track, his face gray with dust. "The war is lost," Rommel muttered. "We must end it before it ends Germany." But Berlin refused to listen. Hitler's orders were absolute. The beachhead must be destroyed, no matter the cost. So the cost was paid. The 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend and Panzer Lehr Division were thrown into the cauldron around Caen, where the British and Canadians had dug in. The fighting there was among the most brutal of the entire campaign. The young soldiers of the Hitlerjugend fought like cornered animals, their zeal both terrifying and tragic. They attacked Sherman tanks with Panzerfausts at close range, ambushed convoys from hedgerows, and refused to retreat even when encircled. Entire companies vanished in days. The fields were littered with the bodies of boys who had grown up believing they were invincible. To the west, the American advance met fierce resistance around Carentan and St. Lo. The German paratroopers of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division fought with skill and discipline, inflicting heavy casualties. Their officers, veterans of Monte Cassino, knew how to make the terrain work for them. Every hedgerow became a fortress, every lane a kill zone. The countryside of Normandy, beautiful, ancient, and green, became a labyrinth of death. Soldiers described hearing the enemy just meters away, but never seeing them, only the flash of a muzzle or the dull thud of a grenade rolling through the grass. But the Allies kept coming. Their artillery was unending, their logistics unstoppable. The Mulberry harbors, vast artificial ports floated across the channel, allowed them to unload thousands of tons of supplies every day. Where German positions ran out of shells, the Allies had mountains of them. The imbalance was total. German units that had once been divisions were now barely companies. The wounded filled every farmhouse, every barn. Medical supplies were gone, and the stench of gangrene spread through the air. The soldiers fought not for victory anymore, but to delay the inevitable. By late June, the German line around Caen had hardened into a desperate defense. The city, once picturesque and quiet, was now a ruin of stone and smoke. Both sides pounded it relentlessly, the Allies from the air, the Germans from their dugouts and cellars. Civilians were trapped between them. Some divisions had lost 3/4 of their strength, yet they held on, clinging to orders that no longer made sense. When Operation Epsom began, the British pushed hard across the Odon River. The German counterattack, led by the remnants of 2nd SS Panzer Corps, momentarily halted them, but at staggering cost. The fields were strewn with burned-out tanks, their crews still inside. The air smelled of oil and death. Rommel's faith in Hitler was gone. He urged negotiations, a way to end the slaughter before Germany was destroyed completely. But that, too, would seal his fate. By July, his name was whispered in the corridors of the Wolf's Lair. The Führer's suspicion had found a new target. When the July 20th plot failed, Rommel was implicated, though his exact role remains unclear. 2 months after D-Day, the man who had once symbolized German military genius was forced to take his own life. In many ways, his death mirrored the death of the army he had built. Proud, disciplined, yet trapped in a war that could no longer be won. As July turned to August, the Allies broke through. Operation Cobra shattered what remained of the German defenses around St. Lo. The U.S. First Army burst into the open countryside, driving south and west with unstoppable momentum. The German front collapsed. Thousands were encircled in the Falaise pocket, a nightmare of fire, steel, and desperation. Allied bombers turned the roads into killing grounds. Convoys of trucks, tanks, and horse-drawn wagons were annihilated from the air. Survivors described it as a scene from hell. Mangled vehicles, shattered men, and the smell of burning flesh thick enough to taste. Out of 100,000 trapped, barely half escaped. Those who did emerged broken, both in body and spirit. For the German soldiers who survived Normandy, the retreat was endless. They fell back through France, hounded by aircraft, ambushed by resistance fighters, abandoned by their leaders. Many had not slept in days, their uniforms soaked in mud and blood. "We were no longer soldiers," one survivor wrote. "We were ghosts carrying rifles." They had fought for a cause that had already died, serving a leader who no longer saw them as men, only as pieces to be moved until they broke. When Paris was liberated in August, the German army in the West ceased to exist as an organized force. What had begun on June 6th as the greatest defensive effort of the Reich had ended in ruin. The Atlantic Wall had not saved them. The Luftwaffe had not protected them. The panzer divisions that once symbolized Germany's might were now twisted wrecks scattered across the French countryside. The dream of a 1,000-year empire had lasted barely 12 years. In the aftermath, survivors of the 716th and 352nd Divisions were captured, many too weak to stand. Some wept, others stared blankly, too numb to feel anything. When Allied officers questioned them, most said the same thing. They had fought because they had no choice, because orders were orders, because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. Few spoke of ideology. Most spoke only of exhaustion. Today, the bunkers of the Atlantic Wall still stand, silent sentinels watching the sea. Their concrete faces are scarred but unbroken, monuments to the futility of the men who built them. Tourists walk where soldiers once died. The beaches that once ran red with blood are peaceful now. Children play where bullets once tore through the air. Yet, if you stand there long enough, in the early morning when the mist rolls in from the channel, you can almost hear it again. The distant rumble of guns, the screams carried by the wind, the echo of a war that changed the world forever. For the Germans who lived it, D-Day was not just a battle. It was the moment they realized the truth, that the tide of history cannot be held back by concrete or faith or fear, that every empire, no matter how powerful, eventually meets its reckoning. And on that gray morning in June 1944, as the Atlantic Wall crumbled under the weight of the world, they learned, in blood and silence, that the reckoning had come. If you've stayed to the end, you're one of the few who still wants the truth. Subscribe, and together, we'll uncover every secret the Second World War tried to keep buried.